The Victorian terraced house on Pound Lane stood quiet in the late afternoon of 1907. Inside, a young mother's scream shattered the stillness as 3-year-old Dorothy Eady's small body tumbled down the steep wooden staircase, limbs flailing, until she came to rest at the bottom in an unnatural heap. The silence that followed was absolute. No crying, no movement. Just the terrible stillness that every parent dreads. The family doctor arrived within the hour, his black leather bag in hand, his face grave as he knelt beside the motionless child. He checked for breath, for pulse, for any sign of life. Finding none, he stood slowly and delivered the verdict that would break a family's heart. Dorothy was gone. The fall had been too severe, the injuries too catastrophic. There was nothing to be done. He covered her small body with a white sheet and offered what hollow comfort medical men of that era could provide. The girl's mother collapsed in grief. Her father stood frozen, unable to process the sudden absence of his daughter's laughter from their home. But death, it seemed, was not yet ready to keep Dorothy Eady. Hours later, as the family made arrangements no parent should ever have to make, something impossible occurred. The doctor returned to examine the body one final time before its removal, a grim formality required by law. When he pulled back the sheet, he stumbled backward in shock. Dorothy was sitting upright in bed, her eyes open and alert, looking at him with an expression that would haunt him for years to come. Not the confused look of a child waking from sleep, but something else entirely. Something knowing. Something ancient. The medical man examined her thoroughly, searching desperately for an explanation that fit within the boundaries of science and reason. He found none. No rational mind could explain what had happened in that London home. The child he had pronounced dead, whose injuries he had documented, whose absence of vital signs he had confirmed, was now completely unharmed, not recovering, not injured and healing, completely whole, as though the fall had never happened. But Dorothy Eady was not the same child who had tumbled down those stairs. In the days and weeks that followed, her parents noticed the changes. Small things at first. The way she would stare at nothing, her eyes focused on something they could not see. The nightmares that woke her screaming about a great building with columns, a garden with pools, a place she called home but had never visited. She begged to be taken there, to go back, though she could not explain where there was. Her parents, still reeling from the miracle of her survival, dismissed it as the confusion of a child who had suffered trauma. Then came the day that changed everything. Her father took young Dorothy to the British Museum, hoping to distract her from the strange melancholy that had settled over her since the accident. They wandered through the halls of antiquities, past Greek statues and Roman relics, until they entered the Egyptian galleries. Dorothy froze. Her small hand slipped from her father's grasp as she moved forward as if in a trance. She ran to the artifacts, pressing her hands against the glass cases, tears streaming down her face. "These are my people," she told her bewildered father. "I am home." She sat down on the floor among the ancient stone fragments and refused to leave. Museum guards were called. Her father pleaded. But Dorothy remained, touching the hieroglyphs with a familiarity that defied explanation, whispering words in a language she had never been taught. When they finally carried her out, she was inconsolable, grief-stricken in a way no child should be capable of feeling. The obsession only deepened. Dorothy began drawing pictures of temples and gardens with an architectural precision impossible for a child her age. She spoke of a pharaoh named Sety, of a great temple at a place called Abydos, of a forbidden love that had ended in tragedy. Her parents consulted doctors, priests, anyone who might explain what had happened to their daughter. Some suggested brain damage from the fall. Others whispered about possession. None could account for the specific, verifiable details that poured from this London child who had never set foot outside England. As Dorothy grew, so did the impossibility of what she knew. She could read hieroglyphics before she learned to read English properly. She corrected Egyptologists on the finer points of New Kingdom burial practices. She described rooms in temples that had not yet been excavated, gardens that existed only in ancient texts, rituals that scholars believed had been lost to time. When archaeologists finally uncovered certain areas she had described in detail, they found she had been right. Eerily, impossibly right. The central mystery that would define Dorothy Eady's entire life crystallized in those early years. How could a child from working-class London possess knowledge that even experts did not have? How could she describe, with precise accuracy, locations she would not visit until decades later? How could she remember, with vivid clarity, a life that had ended 3,000 years before she was born? Was Dorothy Eady truly the reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian priestess named Bentreshyt, a woman who had loved a pharaoh and paid the ultimate price for that forbidden passion? Or was this the most elaborate, most persistent, most inexplicable delusion in modern psychiatric history? The evidence would pile up over the decades to come. Archaeological discoveries that confirmed her visions. Phenomena that defied rational explanation. A love story that transcended death itself. And always, at the center of it all, the question that no one could definitively answer. What really happened when 3-year-old Dorothy Eady died on that staircase in 1907? What came back in her place? And what does her story reveal about the boundaries between life and death, memory and imagination, the possible and the impossible? The truth, buried beneath 3 millennia of sand and skepticism, awaits. The fall happened on a cold January afternoon in 1904, when 3-year-old Dorothy Eady tumbled headlong down the narrow wooden staircase of her family's modest home in Blackheath, London. The sound of her small body hitting each step echoed through the house like a terrible drum beat. By the time her mother reached her, Dorothy lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs, her neck bent at an unnatural angle, her breathing so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. The family doctor arrived within the hour, his face grave as he examined the unconscious child. After a somber consultation with Dorothy's parents, he delivered the devastating news that the little girl would not survive the night. He left medication for her comfort and instructions for the grieving process that lay ahead. But when he returned the next morning to make arrangements for the body, he found Dorothy sitting up in bed, bright-eyed and alert, asking for her breakfast as if nothing had happened. It was, by all medical understanding of the time, impossible. Yet there she sat, very much alive, seemingly unharmed. But Dorothy's parents, devout Christians who attended church faithfully every Sunday, soon realized that something fundamental had changed in their daughter. The girl who returned to them was not quite the same child who had fallen down those stairs. In the weeks following her miraculous recovery, Dorothy began speaking of things no English child should know. She would sit at the dinner table and suddenly announce that she wanted to go home, her small voice trembling with a longing that seemed far too ancient for her years. When her bewildered mother would gently remind her that she was home, Dorothy would shake her head with frustrated tears streaming down her face. No, she would insist, this was not her home. Her real home had large columns and beautiful gardens. Her real home was surrounded by sand and palm trees. Her real home was in a place called Egypt. Her parents initially dismissed these declarations as the confused imagination of a child who had suffered a severe head injury. Perhaps the fall had simply scrambled her thoughts temporarily, they told themselves. Children had vivid imaginations, after all. But Dorothy's insistence grew more persistent, more detailed, more disturbing with each passing week. She would describe the texture of stone beneath her feet, the smell of incense burning in great halls, the sound of a language her London tongue had never been taught to speak. She drew pictures of buildings she had never seen, of symbols that looked unsettlingly like the hieroglyphs her parents had glimpsed in books. When they tried to redirect her attention to dolls and toys appropriate for a young English girl, she would push them away, frustrated and inconsolable. This was not her life, she seemed to be saying. These were not her things. She had been taken from somewhere else, and she wanted desperately to return. The true depths of Dorothy's transformation revealed themselves during a family outing to the British Museum when she was 4 years old. Her parents had thought an educational excursion might broaden their daughter's horizons, perhaps distract her from her increasingly worrying fixation with Egypt. They could not have been more wrong. The moment Dorothy entered the Egyptian galleries, her behavior shifted dramatically. While other children ran excitedly between displays or tugged at their parents' hands with impatient questions, Dorothy became utterly transfixed. She walked slowly through the rooms as if in a trance, her small face pressed against glass cases, her eyes drinking in every artifact, with an intensity that made nearby visitors uncomfortable. Then, without warning, she began to weep. Not the frustrated tears of a child denied a sweet or toy, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere profound and unfathomable. She threw herself at the feet of the ancient statues, wrapping her small arms around cold stone ankles, pressing her lips against dusty carved feet that had been fashioned millennia before. Museum guards approached, concerned and confused, as Dorothy's mother tried desperately to pull her daughter away. But the child clung to those statues with surprising strength, crying out words that chilled her parents to their cores. "These are my people," she sobbed. "These are my people. I want to stay with them. I belong here with them." Her father, embarrassed and frightened in equal measure, finally managed to pry her away, carrying his thrashing, screaming daughter out of the museum, while other visitors stared in shocked silence. On the journey home, Dorothy refused to be consoled. She pressed her face against the carriage window, looking back toward the museum as if being torn from the only home she had ever truly known. Her parents exchanged worried glances over her head. This was beyond the realm of childish fancy. This was something else entirely. The incidents at the British Museum became routine. Despite her parents' growing reluctance to take her there, Dorothy would beg and plead until they relented, hoping each time that perhaps this visit would be different, that their daughter would finally move past this troubling obsession. Instead, each visit only deepened the mystery. Dorothy seemed to recognize objects she had never seen before. She would point to specific artifacts and describe their uses with accuracy that museum curators later confirmed. She knew names of pharaohs and gods that no child her age should possess. She would stand before certain pieces and whisper to them in what sounded like an ancient tongue, her lips forming syllables that her East London upbringing could not possibly have taught her. Other visitors began to notice the strange little girl who haunted the Egyptian galleries, and whispers followed in her wake. Some said she was touched by spirits. Others suggested brain damage from her fall. Her parents simply prayed harder and hoped the phase would pass. But it was the dreams that truly terrified them. Nearly every night, Dorothy would wake screaming or crying, drenched in sweat, calling out for places and people that did not exist in her waking world. She described the same vision repeatedly with remarkable consistency. A building with massive columns that stretched toward a brilliant blue sky, gardens surrounding it, lush and green despite the desert beyond, trees offering shade and fruit, fountains playing in courtyards, the smell of flowers and incense mingling in warm air. She could describe the feel of hot stone beneath bare feet, the play of light and shadow through pillared halls, the sound of prayers being chanted in rooms filled with sacred objects. These were not the scattered illogical fragments typical of children's dreams. These visions had structure, coherence, and a level of detail that suggested memory rather than imagination. How could a child who had never left England, who had grown up surrounded by gray skies and coal smoke, dream so vividly of temples and deserts? Dorothy would wake crying, reaching out for something that was not there, begging to be taken back to the columned building. "I need to go home," she would sob into her pillow night after night. "I have to return there. They are waiting for me." Her mother would rock her and sing hymns, trying to drive away whatever had possessed her daughter's sleeping mind. Her father would sit at the edge of her bed, holding her small hand, wondering what malevolent force had entered their home the day his daughter fell down those stairs. They consulted doctors who suggested the dreams were after effects of head trauma. They spoke to their minister who recommended increased prayer and Bible study. Nothing helped. The dreams continued with unrelenting regularity, always the same place, always the same desperate need to return. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Dorothy was 7 years old, sitting in the family parlor with a magazine her father had brought home from work. She was idly turning pages when she suddenly froze, her entire body going rigid. Her mother, who had been mending socks nearby, looked up at the sudden silence. Dorothy was staring at a photograph in the magazine, her face completely drained of color, her hands trembling so violently the pages rattled. Before her mother could ask what was wrong, Dorothy released a scream of such recognition and longing that it seemed to tear from the deepest part of her soul. "This is it!" she shrieked, jabbing her finger at the photograph with wild excitement. "This is my home. This is where I live. This is where I have to go back to." Her parents rushed to her side and looked at the image that had provoked such a violent reaction. It was a photograph of an archaeological site in Egypt, recently excavated, showing the partially restored Temple of Sety I at Abydos. The massive columns Dorothy had described in her dreams rose from ancient foundations. The footprint of gardens could still be traced in the sandy ground. Every detail she had been recounting since she was 3 years old was there in that photograph, captured in black and white, undeniable and real. How could she have known? How could a child who had never seen this place describe it with such precision? Her father read the caption aloud with a shaking voice, naming the temple, the location, the pharaoh who had built it thousands of years before. Dorothy wept with joy and relief, clutching the magazine to her chest, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "See?" she cried. "See, I told you it was real. I told you I had to go back. Now you have to take me home." Her parents stood frozen, unable to reconcile what they were witnessing with any rational explanation. Their daughter, who had never traveled beyond London, had been dreaming of an actual ancient temple on the other side of the world. She had described its architecture, its surroundings, its atmosphere with an accuracy that should have been impossible. The room seemed to grow colder despite the fire burning in the hearth. Was this divine revelation? Demonic possession? Reincarnation, a concept their Christian faith utterly rejected? Or had their daughter somehow accessed knowledge through means that lay beyond the boundaries of accepted science and religion? They had no answers, only the image of their little girl clutching that magazine. Tears of recognition streaming down her face, begging to be taken to a home that had been dust for millennia before she was born. Whatever had come back up those stairs after Dorothy's fall, it carried with it memories that could not exist in the mind of an Edwardian child. Yet there they were, as real and vivid as the present moment, demanding acknowledgement, demanding return, demanding explanation that the rational world could not provide. In the warm Egyptian nights of 1904, a 3-year-old girl named Dorothy Eady would wake screaming from dreams that were not dreams at all, but memories bleeding through from another lifetime. She spoke of towering columns and lotus flowers, of torchlit corridors that smelled of frankincense and myrrh, of a home that lay somewhere along the banks of the Nile, 3,000 years in the past. Her parents, ordinary middle-class Londoners, could not comprehend what their daughter was trying to tell them. They had no framework for understanding that the child crying in their Edwardian nursery believed herself to be someone else entirely, someone who had died in agony and shame beneath the unforgiving Egyptian sun. The life Dorothy claimed to remember was not one of comfort or privilege, at least not at first. She insisted that she had been born Bentreshyt, a name that meant harp of joy, the daughter of peasant farmers who worked the black soil near the ancient capital. Her memories of that humble beginning were fragmented, glimpses of childhood poverty and struggle, but they sharpened considerably when she described what happened in her 14th year. According to the narrative that would pour from Dorothy's lips throughout her lifetime, Bentreshyt had been chosen for a great honor, one that would elevate her far beyond the station of her birth. The priests of the Temple of Sety at Abydos had selected her to serve the goddess Isis as a consecrated virgin, a priestess who would dedicate her body and soul to the divine feminine forever. The temple at Abydos was no minor shrine. It was one of the most sacred sites in all of Egypt, built by Pharaoh Sety I as a monument to his own glory and as a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Its walls were covered in intricate reliefs depicting the pharaoh making offerings to the entire pantheon of Egyptian deities. Its halls echoed with chanted prayers that had been old when Greece was young. To serve there was to stand at the very center of Egyptian spiritual life, and for a peasant girl, it represented an opportunity that would never come again. But it also meant taking vows that were absolute and unbreakable. A virgin priestess belonged to the goddess alone. Her body was sacred territory, forbidden to mortal touch. The penalty for breaking this vow was not merely dismissal or disgrace. It was death. Dorothy described the initiation ceremony in vivid detail. The white linen robe she wore, the shaving of her head, the ritual purification in sacred water drawn from the temple's own well. She remembered the scent of lotus blossoms that filled the sanctuary, the weight of the ceremonial sistrum in her hand as she shook it to honor Isis, and the solemn words of the high priest as he pronounced her forever separated from the ordinary world of marriage, childbirth, and family. She was 14 years old, and she believed with absolute conviction that she was doing something holy. For several years, Bentreshyt served faithfully. She swept the temple floors, tended the sacred flame, prepared offerings of bread and beer for the goddess, and learned the complicated rituals that marked the passage of the Egyptian year. She lived among other priestesses in quarters attached to the temple, and her days followed the rhythm of prayer and service. It was a circumscribed life, but according to Dorothy, it was also a peaceful one. Until the day Pharaoh Sety I came to inspect the temple that bore his name. Sety was not a young man when Dorothy claimed this meeting occurred. He had ruled Egypt for more than a decade, expanding its borders through military campaigns, restoring temples that had fallen into disrepair, and commissioning monuments that would endure for millennia. He was a warrior king, a builder, a man whose word was law from the delta to the cataracts of the Nile. He was also, according to the memories Dorothy carried, a man capable of becoming utterly transfixed by a young priestess with eyes that reminded him of the goddess herself. The forbidden romance that Dorothy described unfolded with all the intensity and recklessness that marks a love affair built on impossibility. She claimed that Sety noticed her during the temple ceremony, that his gaze lingered, that he found reasons to return to Abydos more frequently than duty required. The initial meetings were stolen moments, brief conversations in corridors where the lamplight flickered against painted walls. But they escalated. According to Dorothy's account, Sety arranged for private encounters in the temple gardens after dark, when the other priests and priestesses had retired, and the stone statues of the gods bore silent witness to the unfolding transgression. Dorothy would describe these meetings with a dreamlike precision that unsettled everyone who heard her speak. She talked about the jasmine that bloomed along the garden paths, the sound of water trickling from a sacred pool, the feel of stone benches still warm from the day's heat. She described Sety's voice, the particular timbre of it, the way he spoke to her not as a pharaoh addressing a subject, but as a man desperate to be seen as simply human. He told her about the loneliness of absolute power, about the wives he had married for political alliances who could never truly know him, about the weight of wearing the double crown and being responsible for the prosperity of an entire nation. And Bentreshyt, young and sheltered and utterly unequipped for the force of his attention, fell in love with him completely. The physical consummation of their relationship was inevitable, and Dorothy never shied away from admitting that it happened. In the shadowed gardens of the temple, beneath the stars that the Egyptians believed were the scattered pieces of the sky goddess Nut's body. The virgin priestess and the living god broke every vow that bound them. Dorothy spoke of this with a kind of tragic defiance, insisting that what she and Sety shared was real love, something pure despite the catastrophic violation it represented. She believed, or at least the memory she carried believed, that the goddess herself would understand, that Isis, who had loved Osiris beyond death, would forgive a mortal woman for loving beyond the boundaries of sacred law. But the gods of Egypt were not known for their mercy toward those who broke temple vows, and the human priests who served them were even less forgiving. When Bentreshyt discovered she was pregnant, the secret that she and Sety had guarded so carefully became impossible to maintain. Her body began to change in ways that could not be hidden beneath linen robes. The other priestesses noticed. Whispers began to circulate through the temple, and finally, the high priests confronted her with direct accusation. The interrogation Dorothy described was not a gentle seeking of truth. It was a brutal exercise in extracting confession, conducted by men who saw her pregnancy as a defilement of everything they held sacred. They demanded to know who had violated her, who had dared to corrupt a consecrated virgin and bring pollution into the house of the goddess. The pressure they applied was psychological and spiritual, reminders that her eternal soul hung in the balance, that the gods were watching, that truth was the only path to any kind of redemption. But they also made clear what would happen if she named her lover. If she spoke Sety's name, the pharaoh himself would face consequences. The political ramifications of such a scandal would shake the foundations of the kingdom. His reputation as a pious restorer of temples would be destroyed. His authority, built in part on his claim to divine favor, would crumble. Bentreshyt faced an impossible choice: the kind that breaks a human soul. She could save herself by speaking the truth, by naming Sety, and perhaps finding some path toward mercy or exile. Or she could protect the man she loved by taking all the blame upon herself and facing the full punishment alone. Dorothy's retelling of this moment was always the most painful part of her narrative, the point where her voice would grow quiet and strained, as if even across 3,000 years the horror of that decision remained fresh. Bentreshyt chose silence. She refused to name her lover, and in doing so, she sealed her own fate. The high priests gave her one final chance to confess, and when she remained silent, they pronounced the only sentence possible for a priestess who had broken her sacred vows. She would die, and her death would serve as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to follow her path. Dorothy described her final moments with a clarity that shocked those who heard it. She spoke of being brought to a private chamber within the temple, a place where the stone walls were thick enough to muffle sound. She was not granted the dignity of a public execution or the mercy of a quick death. Instead, according to the account that lived in Dorothy's memory, she was left alone with the understanding that she must take her own life to spare the temple the pollution of executing her within its sacred walls. The method was her choice, but the expectation was absolute. She could die by her own hand, or she could die by theirs in a manner far more painful. Bentreshyt chose poison, a draught of something bitter that the priests provided, something drawn from plants that grew along the Nile and had been used for such purposes since time beyond memory. Dorothy described drinking it, the taste like copper and decay, the way it burned going down, and then the long, terrible wait as it began to work. The death was not peaceful. Her body convulsed, her vision darkened at the edges, and the pain was extraordinary, a fire that consumed her from within. She died alone on the cold stone floor of that chamber, 14 or 15 years old, pregnant with the child of a king, keeping his name locked behind her teeth even as the life drained out of her. The trauma of that death, Dorothy insisted, was so profound that it echoed across the centuries. The soul that had been Bentreshyt could not rest, could not move forward into whatever afterlife awaited. It remained tethered to that moment of agony and sacrifice, unable to forgive itself for the sin or to forget the love that had caused it. And so when the wheel of existence turned again, and that soul was reborn as Dorothy Eady in London in 1904, it carried all those memories with it, a burden of ancient grief that no child should ever have to bear. This was the mythology that would drive Dorothy's entire existence. Every choice she made, every step she took, was in service to this past life she claimed to remember. She would eventually move to Egypt, live near the temple at Abydos, and spend decades trying to prove that Bentreshyt had been real. But more than that, she spent her life trying to make sense of why she had survived when Bentreshyt had not, why she had been granted another chance at existence while carrying the full weight of that ancient tragedy. The story of the forbidden love between a peasant priestess and a pharaoh became the lens through which Dorothy interpreted everything. It was her origin, her purpose, and her curse, a memory of death that refused to die. The autumn wind that swept across the English Channel in 1933 carried with it more than salt spray and the promise of distant shores. For Dorothy Eady, a young woman of 27 years, standing at the ship's rail as the coast of Egypt materialized through the morning haze, it carried the fulfillment of a promise made lifetimes ago. Or so she believed with every fiber of her being. She had met Imam Abdel Megwid in London, where he studied at university, a careful and scholarly man who found Dorothy's fascination with Egypt charming at first, perhaps even endearing. He could not have known, standing before the altar as they married, that he was wedding a woman who believed herself to be the reincarnation of an ancient priestess. He could not have imagined the nights that lay ahead, the rituals that would transform their bedroom into a temple, the whispered prayers to gods whose names he barely recognized despite his Egyptian heritage. Imam was a modern man, educated in Western institutions, rational and forward-thinking. Dorothy was something else entirely, something that grew stranger with each passing day as they settled into married life in Cairo. The city embraced her like a lover, recognizing a familiar touch, while other British expatriates clustered in their colonial enclaves, speaking wistfully of England and complaining about the heat. Dorothy disappeared into the ancient quarters. She walked streets she claimed to remember from 3,000 years before, turned corners with inexplicable confidence, and spoke Arabic dialects that scholars insisted had been dead for millennia. Eamon watched his young wife with growing concern, then confusion, then something approaching fear. The birth of their son should have anchored Dorothy to the present, should have drawn her attention to the living child in her arms rather than the phantom memories that consumed her thoughts. Instead, she named the boy Sety, after Pharaoh Sety I, the man she insisted had been her lover in a previous life. She would hold the infant and whisper stories of palace gardens and moonlit temples, of stolen moments between a king and a priestess who loved him beyond the boundaries of sacred law. Amon would find her like this, speaking to their son in ancient Egyptian, teaching him prayers to Osiris and Isis before the child could even comprehend language. The nocturnal visits began shortly after Sety's birth. Dorothy would wake in the darkest hours before dawn, her eyes wide and gleaming in the lamplight, and announce that he had come to her. Sety I, she said, visited her in spirit form, as real and tangible as any living man. She described these encounters with disturbing specificity, the weight of his presence, the sound of his voice, the scent of myrrh and desert sand that lingered after he departed. She was not dreaming, she insisted. This was not fantasy or imagination. He came to her, and she welcomed him with the devotion of a priestess who had waited 3 millennia for her pharaoh's return. Ammon began sleeping in a separate room. He would wake to find Dorothy gone from their home entirely, discovering her hours later at dawn, kneeling before makeshift altars she had constructed in hidden corners of their apartment. She burned incense that choked the air with heavy, sweet smoke. She performed purification rituals that required her to bathe repeatedly in water mixed with natron, the same compound ancient Egyptians had used in mummification. She refused certain foods, claiming they were forbidden to her priestly order. She observed feast days and holy periods according to ancient calendars that no one else remembered or honored. The neighbors began to talk. Other Egyptian wives whispered about the strange British woman who acted more Egyptian than Egyptians themselves, but in ways that belonged to the distant, dusty past rather than the living present. Iman's family approached him with delicate concern. This was not normal grief or postpartum melancholia, they suggested. This was something deeper, something troubling. They urged him to seek help for his wife, to consult doctors or religious authorities. But Dorothy had found her own authorities, her own community of sort. The Department of Antiquities, desperate for workers who could assist with the endless cataloging and translation work generated by ongoing excavations, hired her despite her lack of formal credentials. She needed the work, needed the income that a man's increasingly unstable employment could not guarantee. Their marriage was fracturing along fault lines neither of them could repair, and financial independence became necessary. It was in the dusty offices and artifact-filled storerooms of the department that Dorothy's abilities began to manifest in ways that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Colleagues would later describe the unsettling experience of watching her work, the way her hands would hover over unlabeled pottery shards and identify their dynasty and origin with absolute certainty. When the pieces were later analyzed and cross-referenced, she was invariably correct. She translated hieroglyphic inscriptions with minimal training, working through complex religious texts that typically required years of specialized study. Senior Egyptologists would review her translations expecting errors, expecting the fumbling attempts of an enthusiastic amateur. Instead, they found work that demonstrated not just accuracy but nuance, an understanding of context and meaning that suggested deep familiarity with the ancient Egyptian mindset. Dr. Ahmed Khalil, a respected archaeologist with the department, documented several instances of Dorothy's uncanny knowledge in his personal journals. He described bringing her a collection of canopic jars, the vessels used to store organs during mummification, without any identifying labels or context. Dorothy examined them briefly, then began speaking about the individual they had belonged to, describing details about the burial that she could not possibly have known. Weeks later, when the tomb of origin was identified and its records translated, her descriptions proved accurate down to minor details about the deceased's family relationships and cause of death. But it was her knowledge of temple layouts that truly disturbed her colleague. Given architectural plans of excavated temples, Dorothy would point out missing features, doorways that should exist but had not yet been found, chambers that excavation had not yet revealed. On 3 separate occasions, her insistence that certain walls should contain hidden passages led to discoveries that advanced archaeological understanding significantly. She would describe these spaces before they were uncovered, detailing their dimensions, their decorative programs, their ritual purposes. The rational explanations grew increasingly strained. Perhaps she had an eidetic memory and had absorbed information from texts she could not consciously recall reading. Perhaps she was a savant of some kind, with an unusual neurological configuration that allowed for rapid pattern recognition and intuitive leaps. Perhaps she was simply very, very good at reading subtle clues and making educated guesses that happened to prove correct. But those who worked closely with Dorothy struggled to accept these explanations. There was something in the way she touched artifacts, a familiarity that suggested handling rather than study. There was something in the way she moved through reconstructed temple spaces, navigating them in the dark with the confidence of long habituation. There was something in her translations that went beyond academic knowledge, a sense that she was remembering rather than deciphering, that the hieroglyphs spoke to her in a language she had never forgotten. Her insistence on being called Omm Sety, Mother of Sety, became non-negotiable. She introduced herself this way to visiting scholars, to government officials, to anyone who would listen. The name was both declaration and claim, an announcement that her identity was rooted not in her English birth or her failed Egyptian marriage, but in her role as mother to a son named for a pharaoh, and perhaps in something older and stranger still. Iman could not bear it any longer. The divorce, when it came, surprised no one who knew them. He was a kind man who had married someone he thought he understood, only to discover that the woman he loved believed herself to be someone else entirely, someone who had lived and died 3,000 years before. He could not compete with a ghost, could not argue with convictions that ran deeper than reason or evidence. He took what dignity remained and walked away, leaving Dorothy to her obsessions and their son to a childhood that would be anything but ordinary. In the storerooms and offices of the Department of Antiquities, the whispers continued. Dorothy worked with quiet intensity, handling fragments of the ancient world with a tenderness that made observers uncomfortable. She would sometimes stop, mid-task, her hand resting on a piece of inscribed limestone or a painted coffin lid, and her expression would transform into something unreadable, something that suggested she was seeing far beyond the dusty present into depths of time that swallowed ordinary consciousness whole. Was it possible? Some began to wonder in private conversations, in journals they kept locked away, that knowledge could persist across lifetimes? Was it possible that some part of human consciousness survived death and carried with it memories, skills, understanding that could resurface under the right circumstances? The alternative, that Dorothy was simply mad or performing an elaborate deception, seemed almost more troubling. Madness did not translate hieroglyphs with scholarly precision. Deception did not predict archaeological discoveries with consistent accuracy. The question hung in the air of the department offices, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, as Dorothy bent over her work day after day, translating the words of the dead with the facility of someone reading a letter from an old friend, moving through the reconstructed past with the assurance of someone who had never really left it behind. The desert wind carried her homeward, though she had never lived there before. On the 16th of March, 1956, Dorothy Eady stepped off the train at the small station near Abydos, her belongings few, her purpose absolute. She was 52 years old, and after decades of dreaming, decades of waiting, she was finally returning to the place her soul recognized as home. The Temple of Sety I rose from the sand in the distance, its limestone columns catching the late afternoon sun, exactly as she had seen them 3,000 years before, exactly as they had appeared in her dreams since childhood. The locals watched this strange English woman with a mixture of curiosity and caution as she made her way to the simple mud brick house that would be her residence for the rest of her life. It stood barely a stone's throw from the ancient temple complex, close enough that she could see the ruins from her window, close enough that she could walk to them in minutes. The house was sparse, primitive by Western standards. Mud walls, minimal furniture, no running water. But Dorothy didn't care. She had crossed an ocean and traveled through time to be here. Comfort was irrelevant. Proximity to the temple was everything. She took a position as assistant to Dr. Hani El-Zaini, the chief inspector of antiquities for the Abydos region. It was modest work, recording findings, sketching artifacts, helping to catalog the endless fragments of pottery and stone that emerged from the sand. But El-Zaini would soon discover that his new assistant was unlike any archaeological aid he had ever encountered. While other assistants brought enthusiasm and basic knowledge, Dorothy brought something else entirely, something that would challenge his understanding of what was possible. The first incident occurred within weeks of her arrival. El-Zaini was planning an excavation in a section of the temple complex that had never been properly explored. As he discussed the project with his team, Dorothy interrupted quietly. She had been standing to the side, holding a clipboard, her role purely clerical. But now she spoke with an authority that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within her. She told El-Zaini exactly what they would find in the unexcavated section. Not guesses, not theories, precise descriptions. She described the layout of rooms that lay beneath centuries of accumulated sand and debris. She detailed the dimensions of chambers that no living person had seen. She explained the purpose of spaces that existed only as subtle depressions in the desert floor. El-Zaini listened with the polite skepticism of a scientist accustomed to enthusiastic amateurs. Dorothy was known to be eccentric. He had been warned of that. She called herself Omm Sety, claiming to be the mother of Sety. She performed rituals at the temple at night. She spoke of a previous life with unsettling conviction. But eccentric didn't mean knowledgeable, and passion didn't equal accuracy. Then they began to dig, and El-Zaini's skepticism began to crack. The rooms were where she said they would be. The dimensions matched her descriptions. Doorways opened in the walls, exactly where she had indicated they would appear. Corridors turned in the directions she had predicted. What should have been impossible was happening with routine consistency. She would describe a feature, and the excavation would reveal it precisely as she had claimed. Other archaeologists working at Abydos began to notice. They would test her, casually at first, then with increasing intentionality. They would ask her about sections of the temple that had been buried for millennia, areas where no records existed, no previous excavations had ventured. And she would tell them. She would close her eyes as if reading from an internal map and describe what lay beneath their feet. One respected Egyptologist asked her about a particular chamber whose function had puzzled scholars for years. The architectural clues were ambiguous. The few hieroglyphic fragments offered no clear answers. Theories ranged wildly. Dorothy listened to his question, then answered immediately. It had been a purification room, she said, where priests would undergo ritual cleansing before entering the inner sanctum. She described the ceremonies that had taken place there, the specific prayers that had been recited, the symbolic meaning of the chamber's orientation. When subsequent excavation and analysis supported her interpretation, the Egyptologist left Abydos visibly shaken. But the incident that would cement Dorothy's reputation, that would force even the most hardened skeptics to confront the inexplicable, centered on a garden that existed only in her memory. She had spoken of it for years to anyone who would listen. The Temple of Sety I had been surrounded by elaborate gardens, she insisted. Sacred gardens with specific types of trees, flowering plants chosen for their religious symbolism, carefully planned layouts that reflected cosmic order. She described walking through these gardens in her previous life, the scent of acacia blossoms, the shade of sycamore trees, the sound of water flowing through irrigation channels. The problem was that no evidence of any gardens existed. The temple stood isolated in the desert, surrounded by sand and stone. No ancient texts mentioned temple gardens at Abydos. No previous excavations had found any trace of planted areas. Archaeological consensus held that the temple complex had always been essentially as it appeared now, an austere structure rising from barren ground. Dorothy disagreed. With absolute certainty, she pointed to a specific area to the north of the temple. There, she said. That is where the gardens were. She drew maps, showing the layout. She indicated where different species of trees had stood. She marked the location of a wine press used to process grapes from the temple vineyards. She described a sophisticated irrigation system that had kept the gardens alive in the desert heat. For years, no one took her seriously. Gardens required water, organic material, root systems. Such features would leave archaeological evidence. The absence of any such evidence was proof of the garden's non-existence. Dorothy's claims were filed away as more examples of her elaborate fantasy, her need to make her previous life memories more vivid and detailed than they could possibly be. Then, in 1969, Sety authorized an excavation in the exact area Dorothy had indicated. He had other reasons for digging there, structural questions about the temple's foundation. Finding a garden was not the goal. It wasn't even considered a possibility. The excavation team began to uncover something unexpected within days. Their tools struck something organic beneath the sand. Then more. And more. As they carefully brushed away centuries of accumulated desert, an impossible sight emerged. Tree roots. Extensive, intricate networks of ancient tree roots, exactly where Dorothy had said they would be. The roots had been preserved by the dry desert conditions, mummified by the same climate that had preserved the pharaohs themselves. The team worked with increasing excitement and growing unease. They found evidence of irrigation channels. They discovered the remains of a wine press, its stone construction still visible, positioned precisely where Dorothy had marked it on her hand-drawn maps. They unearthed post holes indicating where wooden supports had stood, likely for trellises or shade structures. Every detail Dorothy had described was emerging from the sand. Soil analysis confirmed that the earth in this area had once been heavily enriched with organic material, consistent with intensive cultivation. Botanical experts identified the tree roots as coming from species Dorothy had named sycamore, acacia, persea, tarsia. The layout of the garden matched her descriptions with accuracy that defied any rational explanation. News of the discovery spread through the archaeological community like a shockwave. Scientists who had dismissed Dorothy as a delusional eccentric now had to confront physical evidence that validated her seemingly impossible claims. The garden was real. It had existed exactly where and how she said it had. Despite no historical records, despite no prior archaeological evidence, despite the apparent impossibility of her knowing, the reaction among experts divided sharply. Some saw the garden discovery as definitive proof of reincarnation. How else could Dorothy have known? There was no ancient text she could have read, no previous excavation report she could have consulted. The information had come from nowhere except apparently her own memories of a life lived 3,000 years earlier. These researchers began to seriously investigate reincarnation as a legitimate phenomenon worthy of scientific inquiry. Others searched desperately for alternative explanations. Perhaps Dorothy had access to documents that had been lost or destroyed. Perhaps she had an eidetic memory that had absorbed information she didn't consciously remember reading. Perhaps it was an extraordinary coincidence. Perhaps she had made hundreds of predictions and people only remembered the accurate ones, a form of confirmation bias. But those who worked closely with Dorothy knew these explanations fell short. She didn't make scattershot predictions. Her accuracy rate was unnervingly high. And the garden prediction wasn't a lucky guess. She had provided specific, detailed, testable claims that had proven correct in every particular. Sety himself became one of the convinced. In later interviews, he would speak carefully, aware of how his words sounded, but he would not retreat from his conclusion. Dorothy possessed knowledge that she could not possibly have acquired through normal means. He had tested her too many times, had seen her accuracy proven too consistently, to believe otherwise. Whether one called it reincarnation or something else, something beyond current scientific understanding was occurring. The excavations continued through the 1970s, and Dorothy's role evolved from assistant to essential consultant. Archaeologists would come to her before beginning new digs. They would ask her what to expect, where to focus their efforts, how to interpret ambiguous findings. And more often than not, she would be proven right. She lived in her mud brick house near the temple, content in a way she had never been in England or even in Cairo. She was home, truly home. For the first time since her childhood, fall down the stairs had awakened her memories. The local villagers called her Omm Sety, and she wore the name with pride. She attended to the temple with devotion, cleaning the ancient stones, leaving offerings, performing rituals that echoed across millennia. At night, some villagers claimed to see lights in the temple complex, moving among the columns where Dorothy walked alone. They spoke of hearing her voice raised in ancient prayers, speaking Middle Egyptian with perfect fluency, communing with gods who had not been worshipped in 3,000 years. Whether these accounts were true or embellished, they became part of Dorothy's legend, another layer in a story that had already transcended ordinary explanation. The garden discovery remained the most dramatic vindication of her claims, but it was far from the only one. Chamber after chamber, room after room, her descriptions proved accurate. The mounting evidence created an intellectual crisis for those who encountered it. Accept that a woman from England somehow possessed detailed knowledge of a temple complex as it had existed in the 13th century before the Common Era, or reject the evidence of your own excavations. Many chose rejection, unable or unwilling to embrace the implications. But those who worked with her directly, who saw the pattern repeat too many times to dismiss, found rejection increasingly difficult. Dorothy had waited her entire life to come home to Abydos. And in the desert sand, surrounded by the ruins of the temple she had loved across the centuries, she had finally found her vindication. The archaeological evidence spoke where words could not. The garden grew again, if only as preserved roots in the sand, testimony to a memory that refused to die. The sun fell behind the limestone cliffs of Abydos each evening, and while other workers at the temple complex locked their offices and returned to normal lives, Dorothy Eady moved in the opposite direction. As darkness claimed the ancient site, she came alive with a purpose that unsettled even those who had known her for years. The tourists had departed, their cameras packed away, their voices fading into the desert wind. The archaeologists had returned to their quarters to catalog the day's findings over cigarettes and speculation. But Dorothy remained, and what happened in those hollow midnight hours would become the most disturbing chapter of her strange life. She kept a room near the Temple of Sety I, a modest space with whitewashed walls and minimal furnishings. Those who visited described it as monk-like in its austerity, save for one detail that gave them pause. The walls were covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions she had copied by hand, prayers and invocations to gods whose names had not been spoken aloud for millennia. Offerings sat in small bowls along makeshift altars, dates and bread and wine, that she replaced each day with ritualistic precision. But these daytime preparations were merely prologue to what came after dark. According to multiple testimonies from local workers and night watchmen, Dorothy began her nightly rituals around 10 in the evening, always after ensuring she was alone. She would bathe in water she claimed came from a sacred well, changing into a simple linen gown that resembled ancient Egyptian dress. Then, carrying a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the temple walls, she would make her way through the colonnade to the innermost sanctum of the temple. Ahmed Hassan, who worked as a night guard at Abydos for nearly 20 years, gave a statement in 1973 that remains difficult to dismiss. He reported seeing lights moving through the temple long after Dorothy should have been asleep, strange flickering illuminations that seemed to pulse with irregular rhythm. When he investigated, drawn by duty and mounting unease, he would hear her voice carrying through the stone chamber. But she was not speaking English or Arabic. The words that echoed off walls 32 centuries old were in a language that should have been utterly dead. Hassan claimed she chanted in what she called the ancient Egyptian tongue, not the dead academic reconstruction scholars use, but something fluid and musical that seemed to come from some deep well within her consciousness. He described it as beautiful and terrible at once, a sound that made the hair on his neck stand rigid. Other workers corroborated his account. They spoke of hearing her voice rising and falling in patterns that suggested conversation, though she was always found alone. She would address someone, pause as if listening to a response, then continue with answers and questions directed at empty air. The most disturbing element of these testimonies involved the lights themselves. Multiple witnesses over the years reported seeing luminescence inside the temple that could not be explained by Dorothy's single oil lamp. Some described a golden glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the sanctuary. Others spoke of blue-white flashes that appeared and vanished like lightning trapped in stone. When pressed for rational explanations, they had none to offer. Dorothy herself refused to discuss these phenomena with outsiders, but her private writings reveal what she believed was happening during those midnight hours. She kept detailed journals of what she called her spiritual communions with Pharaoh Sety I. These were not vague mystical experiences but specific, detailed encounters that she recorded with the precision of a court stenographer. She described how his spirit would manifest in the temple sanctuary, how they would speak about matters of history and religion, about the pain of their separation across time, about the mysteries of ancient Egyptian theology that had been lost when the last temple closed. She wrote these accounts in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made them more unsettling than if she had written with breathless mysticism. What separated Dorothy's experiences from typical spiritualist claims was her insistence on verification. She would write down historical details that Sety's spirit allegedly told her, then wait for archaeological discoveries to confirm or deny them. In several documented cases, information she recorded years earlier aligned with inscriptions that were only later uncovered or translated. She predicted the location of certain temple gardens based on what she claimed Sety had told her. When excavations were conducted, the gardens were found precisely where she indicated, complete with specific plants she had named. Dr. Klaus Baer, an Egyptologist from the University of Chicago, investigated her claims in the early 1970s. While he remained skeptical of supernatural explanations, he admitted in a private letter that some of her knowledge was difficult to account for through normal means. She possessed understanding of temple rituals and daily life in ancient Egypt that went beyond what was available in published sources. When challenged, she would provide details that seemed to come from nowhere, only for those details to be confirmed when new texts were discovered or existing fragments were newly understood. The automatic writing began in 1969. Dorothy woke one night with her hand cramping and found herself at her small desk, pages covered with hieroglyphic text she had no memory of composing. This happened again and again over the following months. She would enter a trance state, she later explained, and her hand would move of its own accord, filling page after page with ancient Egyptian script. The result was a manuscript she called the Abydos Passion Play, 70 pages of ritual drama describing the death and resurrection of Osiris. The manuscript presented an enormous problem for scholars. It appeared to be an ancient Egyptian text of a type that had been lost, a complete temple ritual drama with stage directions, dialogue, and ceremonial instruction. The language was consistent with Middle Egyptian, the grammar and vocabulary appropriate to the period she claimed it came from. Several experts examined it, looking for anachronisms or errors that would reveal it as a modern fabrication. They found none they could definitively identify. Dr. Hassan el-Shazli from Cairo University studied the manuscript for months. His conclusion, published in a limited circulation academic journal, was cautious but troubling. He could not prove the text was ancient, but neither could he prove it was modern. The theological concepts it contained were consistent with ancient Egyptian belief, but included nuances and variations not found in surviving text. Either Dorothy had somehow channeled an authentic ancient document, he suggested, or she possessed knowledge of ancient Egyptian religion so deep and intuitive that she could compose original texts indistinguishable from genuine articles. The manuscript described rituals that should have been performed at Abydos during the annual Osiris mysteries. It included hymns and prayers, processional routes through the temple complex, and specific offerings to be made at designated stations. Some of these details matched fragmentary inscriptions already known. Others described practices for which there was no archaeological evidence, yet which fit perfectly with the logic of Egyptian religious thought. The text felt authentic in ways that went beyond mere technical accuracy. Those who knew Dorothy during this period described a woman walking the razor edge between transcendence and dissolution. She slept little, ate sparingly, and spent increasing amounts of time in states she called meditation, but which others feared was something closer to dissociation. Her eyes, locals reported, had taken on a distant quality, as though she was looking at something beyond the visible world. She moved through the temple grounds like a ghost herself, touching walls and columns with a familiar intimacy that suggested she remembered them from some other time. The conversations she claimed to have with Sety became more frequent and more detailed. She wrote them down in dialogue form, capturing what she insisted were his exact words on topics, ranging from ancient politics to the nature of the soul. He explained to her, she recorded, the true meanings of certain hieroglyphic texts that scholars had misunderstood. He described the actual ceremonies performed in the temple during his reign. He even corrected her on points of history where she had accepted conventional academic wisdom. What made these accounts genuinely disturbing was their occasional accuracy. She wrote that Sety told her about a hidden chamber in the temple that contained records of temple donations. 3 years later, during renovation work, such a chamber was discovered containing administrative papyri, documenting offerings made to the temple. She described a specific scene from Sety's childhood that she claimed he had shared with her. When a damaged inscription was later cleaned and re-examined, it contained a reference to an event matching her description. Skeptics argued she was simply skilled at reading archaeological literature and making educated guesses. But those who worked with her closely found this explanation insufficient. She demonstrated knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere beyond books, an understanding of ancient Egyptian life that was holistic and lived in rather than academic and abstract. She knew how things smelled, how they felt, which direction shadows fell at different times of day, in rooms that had been roofless ruins for centuries. The local Egyptian workers at Abydos developed a complex relationship with Dorothy's nocturnal activities. Some avoided the temple at night, frightened by the lights and sounds. Others felt protective of her, believing she was touched by something sacred rather than insane. They brought her food when she forgot to eat, checked on her when she disappeared for too long, and quietly accepted that something inexplicable was happening in their midst. There were nights, they said, when the temple seemed to wake up. The air would grow thick and charged, carrying a scent like myrrh and lotus flowers. The stones themselves seemed to hum with a frequency felt more than heard. On these nights, Dorothy's chanting would reach a fever pitch, her voice rising in ancient prayers that seemed to be answered by the desert wind. Some workers claimed to see shadows moving inside the temple, human-shaped but not quite human, flickering in and out of perception like heat mirages. Dorothy herself wrote about moments when the veil between worlds grew thin. She described Sety manifesting not just as a voice or presence, but as something she could see and touch. These encounters left her emotionally devastated, she admitted, torn between joy at the contact and agony at his inevitable disappearance. She wrote of holding conversations that lasted hours, of receiving embraces that felt absolutely real, of a love that transcended death and time, but could never be consummated in any meaningful way. The question that haunted everyone who knew her story was ultimately unanswerable. Was Dorothy Eady genuinely in contact with the spirit of a pharaoh who died more than 3,000 years ago? Or was she experiencing an elaborate delusion constructed by a mind that had never recovered from childhood trauma? The evidence pointed in contradictory directions. Her knowledge and predictions suggested something beyond mere fantasy. Yet the alternative, that the dead could and did return to communicate with the living, violated everything modern rationality held dear. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between, in a space where psychology and the supernatural might not be as separate as we assume. Perhaps in surrendering so completely to her obsession, Dorothy had accessed some deep well of human consciousness, where racial memory or collective unconscious stored knowledge of the ancient world. Or perhaps, as she insisted until her death in 1981, Pharaoh Sety I truly loved her across the centuries and found ways to bridge the impossible distance between life and death. The temple at Abydos still stands, its stones silent about what they witnessed during those long midnight hours. The workers who saw the lights have grown old or passed on themselves. But Dorothy's writings remain, disturbing documents that refuse easy categorization. The Abydos Passion Play sits in academic archives, authentic and impossible at once. And on certain nights, some say, if you stand in the sanctuary where she performed her rituals, you can still feel something in the air, a presence that suggests the dead may not be as gone as we would prefer to believe. In 1966, a middle-aged Englishwoman stood before the high walls of the Osiris at Abydos and made a statement that would trouble the archaeological establishment for decades. Dorothy Eady, known to locals as Omm Sety, pointed to the ancient structure and told visiting Egyptologists that they had gotten the water level wrong. Not by inches, but by feet. She described exactly where the sacred pool had once stood, how deep it had been, and what religious ceremonies had taken place around its edges 3,000 years ago. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had witnessed these events personally. The problem was, she had no academic credentials, no archaeological training, and no rational explanation for her knowledge. The bigger problem was that she was right. The academic community had long dismissed Dorothy as an eccentric, possibly disturbed woman, whose obsession with ancient Egypt had created elaborate fantasies. But when researchers began examining her specific claims against new archaeological evidence, a pattern emerged that defied comfortable explanation. Her corrections to published Egyptological works were not vague spiritual impressions or general historical feelings. They were precise, technical, and verifiable. And they kept being proven accurate. Dr. Kenneth Kitchen, one of the most respected Egyptologists of the 20th century, encountered Dorothy during his work at various temple sites. A rigorous scholar known for his conservative approach to evidence, Kitchen had little patience for mysticism or pseudo-archaeology. Yet his assessment of Dorothy's knowledge was unequivocal and deeply troubling to conventional explanations. He stated publicly that her familiarity with ancient Egyptian religious practices, temple layouts, and hieratic texts exceeded what could be acquired through normal study. This was not a New Age enthusiast offering Kitchen a qualified compliment. This was a leading academic authority admitting that an untrained temple worker knew things she could not possibly know. The specifics of what Dorothy knew make the mystery more acute. She corrected published floor plans of the Temple of Sety I at Abydos, identifying chambers and passageways that were later discovered during renovation work. She described the original placement of reliefs that had been moved or damaged over millennia. Details confirmed when workers uncovered foundation marks, showing where these massive stone carvings had first stood. She told excavators where to dig for specific artifacts, and they found them. Not sometimes. Repeatedly. One incident particularly troubled the archaeological team working at Abydos in the 1970s. Dorothy informed them that a specific garden had existed in a courtyard area where no evidence of cultivation had been found. She described the types of plants grown there for ceremonial use, the layout of the beds, and the irrigation system that fed them. Excavators dismissed her claims until ground-penetrating surveys revealed ancient water channels in precisely the pattern she had described. When they excavated, they found soil composition consistent with sustained ancient horticulture and pollen samples matching the plant species she had named. Dr. Rosalie David, an Egyptologist at the University of Manchester, worked with Dorothy on several occasions and later wrote about the experience with evident unease. David noted that Dorothy possessed detailed knowledge of ancient Egyptian medical practices, religious rituals, and daily life that aligned with newly discovered papyri and archaeological evidence. But the timeline troubled David most. Dorothy had described specific ceremonies and their precise ritual elements years before the papyri detailing those same ceremonies were discovered and translated. She had not read about these practices and incorporated them into her memories. She had described them first. The Osirian water level remains one of the most concrete validations. Dorothy insisted that the structure had been built as a symbolic representation of the primordial mound rising from the waters of creation, and that the water level in ancient times had been carefully maintained at a specific height for religious reasons. Academic reconstructions had placed the water much lower. Hydrological studies conducted in the 1980s, using core samples and geological analysis unavailable during Dorothy's lifetime, confirmed that the ancient water table had indeed been at the level she specified. She had been correct about the engineering, the religious symbolism, and the practical details of how priests had managed the sacred pool. Her knowledge of hieratic script presents another uncomfortable puzzle. Hieratic, the cursive form of hieroglyphics used primarily by priests and scribes, is notoriously difficult to master. It requires years of specialized study to read with fluency. Dorothy, who never received formal training in hieratic, could read and write it with apparent ease. Scholars who tested her found that she could identify subtle variations in hieratic signs that indicated different time periods and regional styles. This level of expertise typically requires doctoral-level study and extensive practice with primary sources. Yet, Dorothy had worked as a low-paid draftswoman and had no access to the rare manuscript collections necessary for such training. The skeptical explanations sound reasonable at first hearing. Perhaps Dorothy possessed a photographic memory and had absorbed information from obscure academic texts during her time in London before moving to Egypt. Perhaps she had unconsciously synthesized data from multiple sources, creating accurate composite memories that felt real to her. Perhaps she had access to unpublished research notes or academic correspondence that contained the information she later claimed as memory. These explanations weaken under scrutiny of the timeline. Dorothy made numerous specific claims in the 1950s and 60s that were later validated by discoveries made in the 1970s and 80s. Unless we posit that she somehow had access to archaeological findings before they occurred, the photographic memory explanation fails. She described the contents of sealed chambers before they were opened. She detailed the text of papyri before they were discovered. She corrected published scholarship that was itself based on incomplete evidence, and her corrections were proven accurate when more complete evidence emerged. The problem of obscure academic texts leads to its own dead end. Researchers have attempted to trace the sources Dorothy might have read, looking for the origin of her specific knowledge. They have found that much of what she knew simply was not published anywhere during the time she could have read it. The details of certain religious ceremonies she described were not documented in accessible literature until decades after she had already recounted them. The architectural features she identified were not recorded in any site reports available to her. Professor John Anthony West, who studied anomalous archaeological knowledge, investigated Dorothy's case extensively. West approached the matter as a skeptic looking for conventional explanations. He searched for the books Dorothy might have read, the experts she might have consulted, the sources she could have used. His conclusion, published reluctantly, was that no conventional learning path could account for the breadth and specificity of her knowledge. He noted particularly that her information about daily life details, minor ritual practices, and mundane aspects of temple operation showed the kind of knowledge that comes from experience rather than study. Academic texts focus on major ceremonies and important historical events. They do not typically document where temple gardeners stored their tools or what prayers junior priests recited during routine morning ablutions. Dorothy knew these things. The unconscious absorption theory suggests that Dorothy might have encountered information in casual conversations, overheard academic discussions, or picked up details from Egyptologists she met in Egypt. This explanation seems plausible until one examines the technical nature of her knowledge and the isolation of her position. As a temple keeper and minor employee, she had limited contact with the international scholars who possessed cutting-edge research findings. The information she demonstrated mastery of included unpublished data from ongoing excavations, details from restricted academic conferences, and interpretations of newly discovered texts that were still under specialist analysis. Even if she had somehow been present for every significant Egyptological discussion of her era, which she demonstrably was not, this would not explain her knowledge of findings that occurred after she made her claims. Dr. James Allen, who later became curator of Egyptian art at the Metropolitan Museum, encountered Dorothy during fieldwork in Egypt and tested her knowledge of Middle Kingdom religious texts. He presented her with a fragmentary hieratic inscription and asked her to complete it. She did so accurately, then explained the religious context of the prayer and its proper ceremonial use. The fragment was from a text that had only been partially published in specialized academic journals that Dorothy, living in a village without a research library, could not have accessed. When Allen asked her how she knew the text, she replied simply that she had recited it many times as a priestess. Allen, by his own account, had no response. The balance point of this mystery rests on a question of probability. How many times can Dorothy be correct about specific, verifiable details before chance or conventional explanation becomes implausible? She was right about the Osirian water level, right about the temple garden, right about the location of hidden chambers, right about the text of undiscovered papyri, right about architectural features not yet excavated, right about ritual practices not yet documented. At what point does the accumulation of validated claims become more difficult to explain through skepticism than through the possibility she actually remembered what she claimed to remember? The archaeological establishment has never formally acknowledged Dorothy's knowledge as genuinely anomalous. yet individual Egyptologists continue to reference her information as reliable. This creates a peculiar situation where her specific claims are treated as trustworthy data points, while the implications of her accuracy are quietly ignored. Researchers cite her descriptions of temple rituals in academic papers without addressing how an uneducated temple keeper possessed this information. They use her corrections to publish site plans without explaining the source of her corrections. The facts are accepted while the mystery is set aside. What troubles investigators most is not that Dorothy was sometimes right. It is that when she was wrong in ways that match the limitations of ancient knowledge rather than modern mistakes. She described temple ceremonies as they would have appeared to a participant, not as they would be understood by an archaeologist. Her errors, when they occurred, reflected the perspective of someone living in the 19th dynasty who would not have known later developments or earlier history. This pattern of mistakes is, paradoxically, more convincing than perfect accuracy would be. She did not know everything about ancient Egypt. She knew what a priestess of Isis in the reign of Seti I would have known. The evidence creates an uncomfortable equilibrium. Conventional explanations require increasingly elaborate scenarios involving unlikely access to information, improbable chains of learning, and remarkable coincidences of timing. Yet, accepting Dorothy's claims as genuine memory requires abandoning fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of time. Both paths lead to conclusions that resist easy acceptance. The archaeological validations stand as documented facts, verified through rigorous academic process. The explanations remain theories, each carrying implications that challenge different certainties. Dorothy's knowledge was real. Where it came from remains a question that neither skeptics nor believers have adequately answered. On the 21st day of April 1981, Dorothy Eady died in the small house she had built for herself in the shadow of the Temple of Sety I. She was 77 years old. Her body, worn down by diabetes and a lifetime of physical labor in the Egyptian sun, finally surrendered to the same mortality that claims us all. But Dorothy herself would have told you that this was not an ending. It was, she believed, a returning. She had made her wishes clear to those few who remained close to her in those final years. No Christian burial, no Muslim rites. She wanted to rest in the ancient Coptic cemetery near Abydos, a compromise that allowed her to remain in the sacred ground she considered home. And she wanted to face west, toward the temple where she had spent decades as a devoted keeper of mysteries, toward the stone columns where she claimed to have walked 3,000 years before in another body, in another life, in the arms of a pharaoh she had never stopped loving. They honored her request. Her grave lies there still, marked simply, facing the temple across the desert sand. But what Dorothy left behind was not peace. It was questions. Questions that 5 decades later remain stubbornly, maddeningly unanswered. Consider what we know, what has been verified, what cannot be explained away by simple fraud or coincidence. The garden she described in trance, its exact location discovered precisely where her visions claimed it would be, complete with the underground tunnel system no one knew existed. The architectural details she provided about temple modifications that were only confirmed years after her death, when modern excavation revealed what ancient plaster had hidden for millennia. The obscure historical facts about daily life in the 19th dynasty that she casually mentioned and which scholars later verified in newly translated texts, she could never have access. Chief Inspector of Antiquities Abdelmonem Abu Bakr, a man not given to supernatural speculation, once admitted that Dorothy knew things she simply should not have known. Egyptologists who came to Abydos skeptical would leave confused, unable to reconcile the impossible knowledge with their rational frameworks. She was never formally educated in archaeology. She read English translations of common texts available to any enthusiast. Yet somehow, she knew details that existed only in fragmentary hieratic script in museum basements. Details that would not be published in English or any modern language until years after she had already spoken them aloud. How do we explain this? The reincarnation hypothesis that Dorothy herself believed with absolute conviction troubles the scientific mind. Yet, the alternatives seem equally impossible. Could trauma, specifically that fall down the stairs when she was 3 years old, have somehow rewired her consciousness in ways we do not yet understand? Could a severe childhood head injury open neural pathways to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, allowing access to cultural memories embedded somehow in human consciousness itself? Some researchers have suggested that Dorothy's obsession created a kind of savant syndrome, where her entire cognitive capacity focused so intensely on ancient Egypt that she synthesized fragmentary information into seamless knowledge through unconscious pattern recognition. But this theory fails to account for the garden, for the tunnel, for the architectural details she could not have synthesized from available sources because those sources did not exist. Was this proof of life after death? Evidence that consciousness survives bodily extinction and returns again and again? Or was this the most committed, most elaborate, most internally consistent delusion in the entire history of psychiatric study? A delusion so perfect that it produced verifiable archaeological discoveries? 50 years after her death, researchers still cannot definitively explain Dorothy Eady. She remains what she perhaps always was, a mystery wrapped in devotion, an anomaly that refuses easy categorization, a human enigma who lived between worlds and left us with more questions than answers. Her mud brick house still stands near the temple, empty now, slowly returning to the desert from which it came. The rooms where she performed her rituals, where she claimed her ancient lover, visited her in the darkness, where she lived a life split between two realities, remain silent. But in Abydos, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the hypostyle hall and moonlight fills the columns with silver shadows, the local people will tell you something else. They will tell you that the temple is not empty, that sometimes, in the hours between midnight and dawn, two figures can be seen moving among the stone pillars. A pharaoh and his forbidden love, meeting again as they have met for 3,000 years, as perhaps they will meet for 3,000 more. And the question that haunts us remains: was Dorothy Eady a woman touched by madness? Or was she the one person brave enough to remember what the rest of us have forgotten? On the night wind at Abydos, among the columns where she swore she once loved and lost and loved again, the answer remains just beyond reach, like a memory from a life we might have lived but can no longer recall. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.